Settle down, everyone. Today we're talking about CAN bus. If you're looking to engine swap a somewhat modern car, say anything newer than 2001, chances are you've run into all sorts of nightmares surrounding the infamous CAN bus. Let's pretend for a moment that you've swapped a car and gotten everything mechanically worked out, maybe with the help of my engine swapping video. So the engine and trans are mounted and the trans is hooked up to the wheels somehow. Let's also assume that you're able to start and run the engine, maybe with a little help from my wiring video. You probably have to jump the starter solenoid to make that happen, but it can still run. So, by all accounts, this is a running and driving car. But you still need to get the rest of the car's stuff to work. You probably know that if you were to remove the factory ECU and replace it with another one, a lot of things just won't work, at least in relatively modern cars. Things like your dash cluster or ABS or electric power steering. We're going to look into a few ways we can get these things back in working order. There's lots of videos out there that explain exactly how a CAN bus works, but they probably go too in-depth for what you need to know as a hobbyist and maybe even as a mechanic. You don't need to know what binary is or what a byte is. That's for nerds. This video is for folks out there that don't need to know the deep technical knowledge of what a CAN bus is, but want to know how it can impact their project cars and what they can do to get around the limitations CAN bus presents. Alright, let's get into it. We're going to start simple. Back in the ye olden days, when carburetors ruled the world and an 8.2-liter V8 made a whopping 190 horsepower, your speedometer needle in your dash cluster used to be driven directly from the transmission. You'd have a little shaft that was spun by the transmission, and it connected to the speedo, which made the needle move higher the faster the output of the transmission went. Although it wasn't actually a little shaft, it was usually a cable. Kind of like a bicycle's brake cable, but instead of being pushed in and out of a sheath, it was just spun inside of the sheath. Whatever. The speedo was essentially driven mechanically by the transmission. Eventually, the industry shifted to putting an electronic speed sensor in the transmission instead. This speed sensor had a single signal wire, or sometimes two, that went to the speedo within the dash cluster. The dash cluster would read pulses from the sensor wire and move the speedo needle higher the faster the wire pulsed. But also, the ECU, or engine control unit, he needs to know the vehicle's speed as well. That way he can do things like turn off the radiator fans when you're going faster than 20 miles an hour, or activate launch control. So, your vehicle speed sensor in the trans would have to not only be wired to the dash cluster, but also to the ECU. But you know how some cars have a radio that gets a bit louder the faster you drive, so you don't have to turn up the volume when you get on the highway to combat road noise? Now that's a nifty feature called speed controlled volume. So we need to pull yet another wire from the speed sensor to the radio so it can detect the vehicle speed to turn up the volume. 3 wires for one simple signal. Now, enter CAN bus. CAN bus itself is a pretty simple setup. It's just 2 wires that get strung between every module in the car. Let's take a look at how this applies to our example. Let's still wire our speed sensor to the dash cluster for the speedo. But let's now connect our dash cluster to the CAN bus with those 2 wires. So now it can announce or broadcast the current vehicle speed on the CAN bus. Then we can connect our radio to the CAN bus with those same 2 wires so it can receive that vehicle speed broadcast from the dash cluster. It now knows the vehicle speed, so its speed control volume feature can work. We can also connect our ECU to the CAN bus so it can hear that vehicle speed broadcast as well, so it knows if we're going fast enough to turn off the radiator fan. Not only that though, the ECU can also broadcast stuff it knows about, such as the current engine RPM. The ECU is the guy running the engine, so he obviously knows what the RPM is, so he can broadcast that over the CAN bus. Then, the dash cluster, which is already on the CAN bus, can receive that RPM broadcast and show it on the tachometer needle. So both the dash cluster and the ECU are sharing data between each other. And now that the RPM is being broadcast on the CAN bus, the radio can get that RPM and play fake engine noises through the speakers, which is apparently a real thing in real cars. Dear God. Anyhow, nowadays most cars have ABS, or anti-lock braking system. The ABS module monitors the wheel speed for each individual wheel on the car in order to do its thing, so it is keenly aware of how fast the vehicle is going. So we can just hook the ABS module up to the CAN bus, and instead it can broadcast the vehicle speed, and then we don't even need a speed sensor in the transmission anymore. And any module that needs to know the speed can just listen for that vehicle speed broadcast on the CAN bus now. Isn't that neat? So, now you know the role a CAN bus plays in a car. The CAN bus is a network of sorts where various modules can broadcast all sorts of data, and also receive said data that's been broadcasted. A CAN bus module might be something like the dash cluster, ECU, radio, ABS module, etc. And the data could be anything such as vehicle speed or engine RPM or whatever. And these are some basic examples. Sure, things like RPM and vehicle speed may go over the CAN bus, but many other things such as coolant temperature, door lock button presses, headlights on and off, whatever, might be broadcast on the CAN bus for who knows what reason. And as a simple rule of thumb, the newer the vehicle, the more dependent it is on CAN bus. So, imagine you just disconnected one of these modules from the CAN bus, like the ECU for example. If he was gone, he'd stop sending the RPM. And how the other modules handle that issue depends on their programming. Like the radio, if he couldn't hear the RPM broadcast anymore, maybe he'd just be programmed to stop playing the dumb fake engine noises. Or maybe he'd be programmed to stop working at all. Why would the manufacturer program him to do that? Because they hate you. That's why. And because they can. Let's take a look at a real-world example. My LS swapped RX-8. Though the concepts will apply to most vehicles with a CAN bus, just to different degrees. In fact, if you're modifying a car newer than 2001, there's a solid chance that that car depends on a CAN bus. That's not a hard year though, like some manufacturers adopted CAN bus early, some took to it later. My 2004 Mazda RX-8 is indeed a CAN bus car. Things like the dash cluster, the electric power steering, the dynamic stability control, or ABS, they all depend on the CAN bus to be working. So if you were to rip out the factory ECU to, I don't know, swap in a big old God blessed American V8, the modules that depend on the data from the factory ECU aren't going to be happy. But the vehicle my LS came out of also uses a CAN bus. I actually went with an LQ4 out of a 2006 Chevy Express 2500, but I'm going to keep calling it an LS to upset the purists. Anyway, the ECU that goes with my LS, that's the one from the Chevy Express, it also uses CAN bus. In fact, the Chevy Express LS ECU expects to be able to talk to another module in the van called the BCM, or Body Control Module, that controls things like the door locks and the turn signals or whatever. If the LS ECU can't detect the BCM on the CAN bus, it won't let the engine run, as an anti-theft measure. I think GM calls it VATS, or Vehicle Anti-Theft System. Actually, if you take the ECU out of one vehicle and put it in another, even if they're the same make and model, it won't start the engine because it detects the VIN programmed in the BCM is different than the VIN programmed in itself. It checks this by asking the BCM over the CAN bus if the VIN is the same. This is why you need to have your GM ECU reprogrammed to either fix the VIN or disable VATS entirely when you do something like an engine swap or an ECU replacement. Anyway, I digress. The RX-8 ECU can talk on the CAN bus, but so can the LS ECU. Doesn't that mean we could just remove the RX-8 ECU and replace it with the LS ECU? They both use CAN bus, so can't we just connect those two wires to the LS ECU and everything will just work? No, obviously. Look at how much time's left in the video. Did you really think it would be that simple? The sad truth is that not all CAN buses are created equal. In fact, they're almost always different. The best way to explain it is that the RX-8's CAN bus and the LS's CAN bus speak two very different languages. They just wouldn't be able to understand each other. These CAN bus languages, also known as protocols, are usually model specific. There's just no way that a Mazda RX-8 would know how to speak Chevy Express. They're two completely different protocols. Even more than that, a protocol can change during a model's production run. So, a 2009 Legacy ECU likely wouldn't be able to speak to a 2010 Legacy's CAN bus modules. The protocols could have changed during the facelift between those two generations. Or maybe they didn't. Who knows? It's not uncommon for CAN bus protocols to remain largely the same and only have minor changes between, say, model generations. But the fact that we actually don't know is enough to screw things up. It's not like the manufacturer is going to give us the secret sauce to their electronics. God forbid we be able to work on our own vehicles. This all adds up to a pretty big problem because me want big boy LS and RX-8, but me also want my gauges to work and my power steering to power steer. So how can we fix this? Let's go over some of the ways we can sort of work around these issues. Number one, fuck it. We don't need the CAN bus to work. Chances are that if you just remove the factory ECU, things like the door locks and the headlights might still work. Even if they don't, we can just unlock the doors with a key and hardwire the lights to a switch, or just leave the factory ECU in there with no engine connected to it. Whatever it takes to make the thing functional. What really matters is that the damn engine starts and turns the wheels, which is going to happen no matter what chassis we pick, CAN bus or not. It's not ideal because a lot of things won't work, like our factory dash cluster, but who cares? We can just rip that out and put a digital dashboard screen in there or something. And who needs power steering anyway? Me. I need power steering. So let's talk about number 2, fooling the factory ECU. What we could do is keep the factory RX-8 ECU, but we're basically going to strip out most everything it does. No more injectors, no more ignition coils, nothing like that. The original rotary is gone. Then we can take the factory RX-8 crank position sensor, that's the same one that was stuck to the rotary, and we pop that on the LS's crank. So the factory RX-8 ECU will see the LS's crank rotating and think, hey, the engine's running. Now I can broadcast the RPM on the CAN bus. We fooled it. The LS will still have its own factory crank position sensor hooked to its own ECU, so the engine will still start and run and all that. And the RX-8 ECU will continue to broadcast data on the CAN bus, so things should stay happy, right? Yeah, kinda, but not really. It doesn't fix the real issues at hand and may cause others. Like, the RX-8 ECU is going to notice there aren't any injectors hooked up to it anymore and throw a code, meaning you've got a permanent check engine light. Things like cruise control straight up won't work because the RX-8 ECU doesn't control the electronic throttle body anymore. It doesn't even have a throttle body connected to it. The LS ECU does. If you want your coolant temperature gauge to work, you're going to have to splice the rotary's temperature sensor into the coolant loop somewhere. It's just a mess. You also have to make sure that the RX-8's crank position picks up the right teeth, same as on the rotary. But they do sell modified LS crank pulleys that have those teeth machined into them. Look into engine trigger patterns for more information on why this is important. There's just so many edge cases and gotchas that I never really considered going this route. So, what else can we do? Number 3, building a CAN bus translator. It is possible to buy or create a device that translates between LS and RX-8. You'd remove your factory RX-8 ECU, then connect one side of the translator device to where the ECU was. Then you'd connect the LS ECU to the other side. The device would be programmed to convert between the two protocols and effectively pretend to be the factory RX-8 ECU. Again, CAN bus is just 2 wires. If we can broadcast the right data in the right protocol, the rest of the car won't even know the difference. But that's a lot easier said than done. Now, I won't lie, this is the most complicated option. Finding a translator that happens to translate between insert engine here and insert car here probably isn't going to happen. You'd more than likely have to pay somebody to make a custom translator for you or learn to make one on your own. Learning to make a CAN bus translator on your own may sound like a crazy idea, but hear me out. You're sitting here watching this video because you wanted to learn about both engine swapping and CAN bus. You took the time to search for this video, watch it, and learn something new. That means you could do it again. Only this time, search for things like Arduino tutorial, Arduino CAN bus tutorial, and CAN bus reverse engineering. I know these things sound complicated, but I learned how to make my own CAN bus translators from Google searches, and so can you. Moving on, number 4, and this is the one I went with. Use a standalone ECU. Every one of my project cars uses a standalone ECU. I don't have the time or patience to deal with reflashing factory ECUs, so this was my only option to begin with. Many standalone ECUs out there give you the option to pretend or emulate the factory ECU on the car's CAN bus, much like a translator. Each standalone brand tends to do this in different ways. For example, my Haltech Elite 2500 has the inbuilt ability to pretend to be the factory Mazda RX-8 ECU. All you do is select it from this list. Then you wire the Haltech's 2 CAN bus wires into where the factory ECU had them wired, and like magic, things just work. Again, I bonded 2 wires and suddenly my dash cluster and electric power steering just started working. No questions asked. Now, the way each standalone handles CAN bus emulation is different. The Haltech is actually pretty limited in this way. If your car isn't in this list, it can't emulate it. There's always the option to translate from Haltech to your car, but again, CAN bus translators are kind of an ordeal. Other standalone brands, like I think maybe the Link G4 lineup, well, they let you actually create custom CAN bus emulation profiles. But this requires that you already reverse engineered the car's CAN bus or know somebody that has a copy of their profile. And at that point, you've basically made a translator, but just built into the standalone, which is cool, I guess. Now, I personally prefer standalone ECUs, so this was the way I was planning to go no matter what. If my standalone of choice, that being the Haltech, didn't support my chassis, the RX-8, I would have made a translator myself. In this case, though, it wouldn't have been that bad. Remember how I said manufacturers won't give us the secret sauce? Haltech actually does give you the secret sauce. Here it is, right on their website. They go out of their way to define their CAN bus protocol, probably for situations just like this. Thanks, Haltech. Very cool. So that's one half of the translator done. The other half would be reverse engineering the RX-8's CAN bus protocol. But it's not like I'm the first person to have ever swapped an RX-8. These cars are a pretty popular choice for swaps because, rotary things. In fact, here's a fella named Dave who electric vehicle swapped his RX-8 and wanted his factory gauges and electric power steering and whatnot to work. And guess what? He documented the RX-8's CAN bus protocol and is giving it away for free. Thanks, Dave. Very cool. Actually, let's just take a moment to really appreciate what Dave has done for us here. In the repository, where he gives his work away for free, he states, "This has taken hundreds of hours of diagnostics in the car, trawling online, communications with other people, several blown up Arduinos, and a heap of frustration. If you feel this has even saved you 1 hour of time, please think about donating towards my time." You know what, Dave? I think I will. Can we get a thank you, Dave, in the comments? It's people like him who share things like this that keep me in this hobby and keep my projects moving forward. I also feel like I should mention Comma AI's OpenDBC repository because they have just a ton of cars protocols sussed out over there. I'm a big fan of Comma's open source self-driving car stuff. It's super cool tech. All right, let's review. A car's CAN bus is a little network that lives in the car and allows various modules to share data with each other. It helps by reducing wiring and allowing more complex data to be shared among the various modules in the car. The main problem is that each car speaks a distinct language, or protocol, that another make and model straight up wouldn't understand. We can get around this in a number of ways, some of those including fuck it, who cares if stuff doesn't work, fool the factory ECU, build a CAN bus translator, or get a compatible standalone ECU. If you're sitting here thinking, this is all too complicated and probably not worth the effort, you might be right. This is the unfortunate reality we live in and why movements such as the right to repair are so important. It's my car. I paid for it. I should be able to do what I want with it. Remember, it's not CAN bus's fault that Mazda didn't share the protocol with us. It's Mazda's. This is nothing new. If there's any way they can screw us over for money, they will. While there are some easy ways to get by, like my Haltech RX-8 situation, you may not be so lucky. Like if you're working with a chassis that isn't swapped very often. So, I wouldn't blame you if you decided to bail on a project like this and go with an older car that doesn't have CAN bus. What I have sort of stumbled into doing is just sticking to cars from the late 90s and early 2000s. While they still depend on electronics, they don't usually have CAN bus stuff and are usually pretty easy to work with. Even if they do have a CAN bus, they're usually pretty simple, like the RX-8. And this sort of works out for me, because these cars tend to be pretty cheap. Like, I haven't paid over $1,500 for a project car in a long time. But this also sort of pigeonholes me into cars that don't have the CAN bus issue. So at some point, I need to get my hands on something that isn't 20 years old and see what I can do to make working on these cars easier. I have some ideas on what could make CAN bus translation much simpler, but nothing concrete yet. So maybe I consider swapping a newer chassis that'll force me to make something better. But I should probably make something clear. This is only going to get worse. My 2004 RX-8, though it does have a CAN bus, it's a really simple car. Remember, that's a 20-year-old car, if you can believe it. The CAN bus just doesn't really do a whole lot compared to modern cars. Most newer cars entirely depend on the CAN bus. Your locks, your window, infotainment, light controls on the stalks, everything goes through the CAN bus instead of having direct wires to relays or whatever. That's just the way the industry's going, and it's not getting any better. In fact, newer cars usually have 2 or more separate CAN buses. One for high-speed things that are constantly changing, like vehicle speed and engine RPM, and one for lower-speed things that only change every now and then, like door locks and windows. And every manufacturer is doing it differently, which makes things so much more complex. They've even started to encrypt their CAN bus data so that it can be harder to get away with things like translators and standalones. Ideally, given enough time, there will be better solutions down the road on how we can integrate our swaps into factory CAN buses, but given how much effort it takes to reverse engineer a CAN bus, I can see why that would be difficult. Hopefully, I've given you a good idea on how you can move forward with your swap. This is by no means a comprehensive list of ways to tackle a swap in a CAN bus dependent car, but ideally you now know the limitations and a few ways to work around them. I know things have been slow on this channel, but winter really just saps the life out of me. But I've still been working on a number of projects, some that even have to do with CAN bus. Actually, you know what? Here's a little sneak preview. If you want to see more of all that, check out my Discord or my socials. I post little snippets of what I'm working on over there from time to time, including an extended version of what you just saw. If you have any questions or comments, drop them below. Also, shout out to anybody who's purchased a shirt. I mean, I can see why you did. These are fucking bangers. Who wouldn't want one of these? All right, I gotta go. I got cars to unblow up. Bye for now.